Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is a crash course in fundamental zoology. We're taking a complex stack of sources, specifically Chapter 40 of Campbell Biology, and we're going to distill the critical knowledge you need to understand how animals work.
Exactly. We're diving into form, that's anatomy, and function physiology. And the big question here really is, how do animals keep a stable internal state when the world outside is, well, constantly changing?
And to kick things off, let's look at maybe the ultimate master of this, the emperor penguin. I mean, the source material paints this incredible picture of them in the Antarctic winter
It's just an unbelievably harsh environment. You're talking negative 40 degrees Celsius.
and winds over 200 kilometers an hour. It's insane.
It is. And their survival is this perfect case study of how form, function, and behavior all link up. Their form, for instance, includes a massive amount of insulation.
Right, like that thick layer of blubber, the fat, right under the skin.
Exactly. That's slowing heat loss. But then you have function.
When the insulation isn't quite enough.
Right. They can actively generate their own heat by shivering. You know, those rapid muscle contractions are just converting chemical energy into heat.
And then there's the third piece, the behavior, the huddling.
The huddling is key. It massively reduces the total exposed surface area of the colony, which just slows down how fast they lose heat to that frigid air.
You know, that brings us right to our first big idea. The universe itself, the laws of physics, they impose limits on how animals can be built.
Absolutely. It's called the law of scale. And the best way to understand it is with the surface area to volume ratio.
Okay, so if you're a single cell like an amoeba, you have a huge surface area for your tiny volume.
A massive surface area. So you can just exchange nutrients, waste, gases directly with the environment. It's simple.
But as you get bigger, your volume, it just explodes compared to your surface area.
It does. The volume goes up by the cube, surface area only by the square. That ratio shrinks fast. And if you're a large animal, the cells deep inside are just too far away from the outside to get anything. They'd starve.
So evolution's answer to this huge design problem is basically to solve everything.
It is, yeah. To create these massive, specialized internal exchange surfaces. Think about your lungs. It's not just two bags of air. It's this incredibly branched network of microscopic sacs. Or your small intestine, it's lined with millions of these tiny finger-like villi.
All to maximize that surface area.
Exactly. And all these surfaces, they don't exchange with the outside world directly. They use a middleman.
The interstitial fluid.
The interstitial fluid that bathes all the cells, which in turn exchanges with your blood. It's this beautiful layered system.
And these physical laws, they don't just shape the inside, they shape the outside too. This idea of convergent evolution.
Oh, yeah. Similar environments, similar problems. You get similar solutions, even in totally unrelated animals.
The classic example being that torpedo shape, the fusiform body.
Right. Tuna, sharks, dolphins, even penguins, a fish, a mammal, a bird, they all have that tapered shape.
Because it's just the best way to cut through water and reduce drag.
It just is. I mean, physics is non-negotiable. The source even mentions how this affects things like figuring out how fast a T-Rex could run.
Really?
Yeah. The question is, could its leg muscles have been big enough to support a full-on run, or was it more of a very fast walk? The physics of bone and muscle mass puts a hard limit on it.
Okay, so we get the physical constraints. Now let's drill down into how the machine is actually built, this hierarchical organization.
That's right. It starts with cells, which form specialized tissues. Tissues group into organs, and organs work together in organ systems.
And it's not like an organ only belongs to one system, right?
Not at all. Many pull double duty. The pancreas is the perfect example.
It's part of the digestive system, making enzymes.
And it's a key part of the endocrine system, making hormones like insulin to control your blood sugar.
All right, so let's get into the four main building blocks, the four major animal tissues. Let's start with epithelial tissue.
The barriers, these are your skin on the outside and the linings of everything on the inside. They're made of tightly packed cells.
And their key feature is this polarity, you said.
Polarity, yes. They have two different sides. An apical surface that faces the outside or an internal cavity.
And a basal surface on the other side.
Right, which is anchored down. And this allows the two sides to do completely different things. It's incredibly efficient.
So how do you get different functions like protection versus, say, absorption?
It's all about the shape and number of layers. For rapid diffusion, like in your lungs, you want super thin single-layered cells. That's simple squamous.
But for something like your skin, you'd want the opposite.
Exactly. You want multi-layered, tough, regenerating cells, that stratified squamous. It's all about form-fitting function.
Okay, next up, Connective tissue. And this one is almost the opposite of epithelial, right? It's defined by its looseness.
It is. It's a sparse population of cells, but they're scattered throughout this incredibly important substance called the extracellular matrix.
And that matrix is the key.
It's everything. It can be a liquid, a jelly, or even a solid, and it's filled with different protein fibers that give it its properties.
What kind of fibers are we talking about?
Well, you have strong collagenous fibers for strength. You have elastic fibers that let tissues stretch and snap back. And then you have tiny reticular fibers that kind of join everything together.
So by mixing and matching these, you get everything from the stuff that holds your skin on
That's loose connective tissue,
to the really dense stuff in tendons and ligaments.
fibrous connective tissue, and then you get the really specialized ones. Bone, which has a mineralized hard matrix. Cartilage, which is tough but flexible.
Adipose tissue for fat storage.
And even blood, which is wild to think about as a connective tissue, but its cells are suspended in a liquid matrix called plasma.
Okay, so that's structure. Now for movement. Muscle tissue.
Right. And there are three main types. First is skeletal muscle. This is what you control voluntarily. It's attached to your bones and it looks striped or striated.
Then there's smooth muscle.
Smooth muscle is involuntary. It's in the walls of your digestive tract, your blood vessels. It handles all the slow, sustained contractions you don't think about.
And the third one, cardiac muscle, is kind of a hybrid, isn't it?
It is. It's striated like skeletal muscle, but it's involuntary. And its fibers are branched and connected by these special junctions called intercalated discs.
And those discs are critical.
Absolutely critical. They let the electrical signal pass from cell to cell almost instantly, so the whole heart contracts in a synchronized way.
And finally, the fourth tissue. The body's wiring, nervous tissue.
This is your information superhighway. It's made of neurons, which transmit signals.
Along those long axons.
Yes, but they don't work alone. They're supported by a whole host of glial cells, or glia, that nourish them and keep everything running smoothly.
Okay, so we've built the animal. Now, how is it all controlled? You've got these two major communication systems.
Right, and they offer this really beautiful contrast and strategy. You've got the endocrine system first.
This is the slow one, right? The hormones in the bloodstream.
It's slow, it's broadcast everywhere, and its effects can be really long-lasting. It's like sending out a mass email. Only cells with the right receptor can actually read the message.
Whereas the nervous system is the complete opposite.
Exactly. It's like a dedicated high-speed fiber optic cable. An impulse travels down a specific axon to a specific target. It's incredibly fast, but the effect is very short-lived.
And both of these systems are working together to achieve the main goal, this idea of homeostasis.
The maintenance of internal balance, it's the whole point. Keeping things like your temperature, your pH, your glucose levels, all within a very narrow normal range.
And to do that, an animal has to make a choice, basically.
Yeah.
It can either regulate or conform.
Yes. A regulator, like a river otter, will burn a ton of energy to keep its body temperature stable no matter how cold the water is.
But a conformer, like a base in that same river,
It just lets its internal temperature match the water. Both strategies work, but regulating is way more expensive, energetically speaking.
and the mechanism driving almost all of this regulation is the feedback loop, specifically negative feedback.
Negative feedback is the core principle of homeostasis. A stimulus causes a change, a sensor detects it, a control center decides what to do, and a response is triggered.
But the key is that the response reduces the original stimulus.
It negates it. That's the negative part. If you get too hot, you sweat. Sweating cools you down, which reduces the heat that triggered the sweating in the first place. It's self-correcting.
And then, very rarely, you see positive feedback.
Which is the opposite. It amplifies the stimulus to drive a process to completion, like contractions during childbirth. It's not about stability, it's about finishing a job.
This stable state, homeostasis, it isn't completely static, is it? It allows for change.
It has to. A great example is the circadian rhythm. Your body temperature isn't fixed at 37 degrees Celsius. It actually cycles up and down predictably over a 24-hour period.
It's this internal biological clock.
It is. The source mentions the Nobel Prize-winning work that figured out the molecular gears of this clock. It's literally hardwired into our cells.
And what about longer-term adjustments?
That's acclimatization. It's a temporary physiological adjustment. If you move to a high altitude, for instance, your body will, over days or weeks, adjust your breathing and blood chemistry to cope with the lower oxygen.
Okay, let's pivot to the biggest homeostatic challenge of all, thermoregulation, managing body heat.
Right. And first, we need to throw out the terms warm-blooded and cold-blooded. They're misleading.
So what are the better terms?
We use endotherm for animals that get most of their heat from their own metabolism, like us and other mammals and birds, and we use ectotherm for animals that get most of their heat from the environment, like a lizard basking on a rock.
And it's not about the actual temperature, but the source of the heat.
Exactly. A hot lizard can be warmer than a cold mammal. It's all about where the heat comes from.
And animals are constantly exchanging heat with their environment through, what, 4 main processes?
4, yes. There's radiation, like the heat you feel from the sun, evaporation, which is cooling, like when you sweat, convection, which is heat transfer by moving air or water, like wind chill, and conduction, which is direct contact.
So to control their temperature,
Yeah.
animals need adaptations to manage those 4 things. Insulation is a huge one.
Huge, especially in water, which sucks heat away 50 to 100 times faster than air. That's why marine mammals need that incredibly thick layer of fat, that blubber.
And the circulatory system can also make these sort of minute-by-minute adjustments.
It can. Vasodilation, which is widening the blood vessels near your skin, dumps heat. You get flushed.
And vasoconstriction does the opposite.
Narrows those vessels, keeps warm blood in your core to conserve heat.
But the most amazing circulatory trick has to be countercurrent exchange. This one is brilliant.
It's a masterpiece of biological engineering. So in the leg of a goose standing on ice, the artery carrying warm blood down runs right next to the vein carrying cold blood back up.
And they flow in opposite directions. Why is that so important?
Because it sets up a continuous heat gradient. As the warm arterial blood flows down, its heat transfers sideways into the cold venous blood flowing up. So by the time the arterial blood gets to the foot, it's already cool.
So the foot doesn't lose much heat to the ice.
Very little. And the heat that was transferred gets carried right back up into the body's core by the venous blood. It's like a heat recycler.
And if that's not enough, endotherms can just make more heat.
Right.
Thermogenesis.
Right. There's shivering, which we all know, and then there's non-shivering thermogenesis, where hormones trigger certain mitochondria, especially in what's called brown fat, to produce heat instead of ATP.
And we even see ectotherms using a version of this. The source had that amazing example of the incubating Burmese python.
Oh, it's incredible. The female python literally shivers. She contracts her muscles, and that spike in her metabolism generates enough heat to warm her eggs by up to 6 degrees Celsius above the air around them.
Wow, and all of this is being coordinated by the brain's thermostat, right? The hypothalamus.
The hypothalamus is the control center. It senses your blood temperature and triggers either warming or cooling mechanisms.
Which explains what a fever is. It's not the system breaking down.
Not at all. A fever is the hypothalamus deliberately resetting your body's set point to a higher temperature to help fight off an infection. It's a controlled, adaptive response.
Okay, last big topic. Let's talk about the cost of all this. The energy budget.
The bioenergetics. It's all about how energy flows through an animal. We measure the total energy used in a given time as its metabolic rate.
And the difference between endotherms and ectotherms here is just staggering.
It's astronomical. For a resting endotherm, we measure the basal metabolic rate, or BMR. A human's is maybe 1,600 kilocalories a day.
And for an ectotherm?
We measure the standard metabolic rate, SMR. An alligator of a similar size might only need 60 kilocalories a day. Endothermy is just incredibly expensive.
And that cost is related to size in a weird way, isn't it? The metabolic rate per gram is inversely proportional to body size.
It is. A tiny endotherm, like a mouse, has a huge surface area for its tiny volume, so it's constantly losing heat.
So per gram, it has to burn way more energy than an elephant just to stay warm.
About 20 times more. That's why a mouse's heart beats so fast. It's living life in fast forward just to keep the furnace running.
So given these insane energy costs, animals have ways to save energy when things get tough. This is torpor.
Torpor is a physiological state of decreased activity and metabolism. It can be short-term, like the daily torpor of a hummingbird that basically shuts down every night.
Or it can be long-term, like hibernation in winter.
Right, or estivation in the summer to survive heat and drought.
And the source mentioned something really fascinating about hibernation. With European hamsters, their metabolic rate drops, obviously. But something else happens.
This is a huge takeaway. The molecular machinery of their circadian clock, their internal timekeeper, it actually stops oscillating. It just freezes.
It stops. So even running the clock costs energy.
It seems so. Enough energy that the animal decides to shut it down completely to maximize savings.
So to recap, the animal body is this hierarchy of 4 tissues. It's constrained by physics. It's managed by negative feedback loops. And the whole thing runs on a very tight energy budget.
And its ability to dynamically adjust everything, insulation, circulation, metabolism, to maintain that perfect internal balance it's the real marvel of animal life.
And we just heard that the shrew has a metabolic rate per gram 20 times higher than an elephant's, and that some hibernators literally stop their internal clock to save energy. So here's a final thought for you. Given that the clock itself has an energy cost, is there maybe a body size below which an endotherm simply cannot afford the energetic cost of running its biological timekeeping year-round?
A fascinating question about the very price of time itself.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into animal form and function. We will catch you next time.